Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're making this beautiful wool coat from scratch. I've got you covered with step-by-step instructions, so let's jump right in. Before we get started, we need to prepare our pattern pieces. Make sure to transfer all notches and markings to your fabric using chalk or thread. Any pieces that need interfacing will be marked on the pattern. I use sew-in interfacing, which is sewn onto the wrong side of my fabric. For fusible interfacing, attach it to the wrong side of your fabric according to the instructions on the packaging. Edge interfacing is optional but adds more support for the areas here that may experience more stress. I'm attaching mine with some steam. Now that your pattern pieces are ready, let's start sewing. If you know how to sew a welt pocket, feel free to skip forward. First, fold the welt piece right sides together lengthwise. Sew down the sides, leaving one long side open using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn the two sides, clip off any extra fabric around the corners. Now turn the welt piece right side out and press it flat. Sew a straight stitch along the open side of the welt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This helps keep your welt flat before we attach it to the coat. Now we're going to attach the welt to the coat front. Place the welt piece over the rectangular box marking on the coat front, making sure the folded edge is facing the center front of the coat. The raw edge of the welt should line up with the center of the welt box. Sew down the welt along the stitching lines, making sure your stitches stay within the welt box. Now take one of the pocket lining pieces and place it right sides together with the welt. Sew along the stitching line closest to the center front marked in pink, then fold the top of the pocket piece back, pressing it into place. Place the second pocket lining piece with the pocket bag pointing towards the side seam, then sew down along the second stitching line marked in pink here. You should now have the pocket lining fully attached to the welt. Use a pair of sharp scissors to cut down the center of the welt, but make sure to stop right before the triangular notches at both ends. When you reach those notches, carefully clip diagonally to create the small triangular corners. Now pull the pocket lining through the welt opening to the wrong side of the coat front. Gently press the welt so the folded edge is facing the side seam. Now we'll pin the edges of the pocket lining and the welt, then sew them together, catching those little triangular pieces of fabric at the welt opening. This step ensures the pocket stays neat and secure. To finish the pocket, you can either edge stitch the welt to the coat for a nice top stitch look, or you can use an invisible stitch like I'm doing here. Now that our body pieces are all ready, it's time to start sewing the shell. First, we'll attach the front and back coat pieces at the shoulder seams. Sew them right sides together and press those seams open for a clean finish. Next, sew the front and back pieces together at the side seams. Once again, press those seams open. Optional, but I highly recommend top stitching the shoulder seam to the front for a clean finish. The shoulder seam should be trimmed on one side and folded over towards the front. Alternatively, you can use a catch stitch on the inside like I'm doing here if you don't want any top stitching to show. For the sleeves, start by sewing the sleeve tab pieces together along the two longer sides. Once done, trim the seam allowances and turn them right side out. Now attach the sleeve tab to the upper sleeve, lining up the notches carefully. Then sew the upper and under sleeve pieces together. Be sure to match up the notches on the front and back sides of each sleeve. Once both sleeves are assembled, it's time to attach them to the coat body right sides together. I recommend basting them first to make sure everything lines up before you start sewing. Make sure your sleeves are attached to the correct armholes, the left sleeve to the left armhole and right sleeve to the right. Next, we're going to start sewing the lining. Attach the facing pieces to the lining pieces right sides together, then press the seams open. Repeat the same steps we did for the coat shell. Sew the front and back lining pieces together at the shoulder seams, then at the side seams, and then create the sleeves and attach the sleeves. Once that's done, we'll have both the coat shell and the lining ready to go. To attach the shell and lining at the sleeve cuff, insert the lining sleeve into the coat sleeve with the wrong sides facing each other. Pull the two sleeves out by the cuffs and then pin them right sides together at the cuffs, making sure to match up the seams on the two sleeves. Sew the cuff hem with the lining and shell pieces right sides together, then press the seams open carefully and repeat the process for the other sleeve. Now our coat and lining should be attached at the sleeve cuffs. To create the collar, start by sewing the two under collar pieces together at the back using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press the seams open. Then sew the collar stands to both the under collar and the top collar. If you use sew-in interfacing for the collar, you'd attach it now. Next, fold the under collar along the roll line and press with steam to set the collar shape. Then sew the top and under collar pieces together at the style line where I've indicated, being sure to stop a 1/4 inch before the neckline seam. I like to sew from the center of the collar with the under collar facing up. Since the under collar is slightly smaller than the top collar, you can gently pull on it to ease it into the top collar. Now that you're done, clip the tips of the collar and turn your collar right side out. Before we attach the collar to the coat, sew a straight stitch along the neckline of both the shell and the lining pieces to prevent any stretching. Attach the undercollar to the shell neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that the 1/4 inch gap we left in the collar is folded and tucked inwards. Now match the lining of the coat to the top collar neckline seam, right sides together. Sew them together, making sure to tuck the 1/4 inch tail we left in the top collar inwards also. Keep your coat right sides together. We're going to sew the facing to the shell along the center front. Start from the little bit of neckline that isn't covered by the collar and pivot to sew down the center front. Be really careful not to catch the sleeves or other material while you're doing this. Clip the front neck corner once you're done. These are all optional steps that will make your coat a little more comfortable to wear. Turn your coat right side out, and you're going to understitch the center front seams to the facing. We're also going to add small thread chains to the underarm and shoulder seam to attach the lining to the shell. This will prevent the sleeve lining from flipping to the outside. Optionally, also add a thread chain from the front facing to the pocket lining so the pocket is always pointing towards the center front. We can also hand sew the shell and lining together at the neckline so the collar doesn't move around. With everything sewn together, let's finish this coat. Make sure you have your hemline marked on your shell and optionally press the hem first. Next, turn the coat inside out so the right sides of the lining and shell are together, then sew the facing and shell together at the front corners. Only sew about 1 inch in, and the seam allowance here should be 1.5 inches. Now pivot the facing towards the shell hem so the lining and the shell hem match up. Sew on the diagonal here from the end of the last stitch to where the lining starts, then continue sewing for about 7 to 8 more inches with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim the front corners, then turn the entire coat right side out through the gap we left at the hem in the center. Make sure the hem is folded at the final length, which is about 1.5 inch seam allowance, and give it a good press. Hand stitch the shell hem with a catch stitch. Then fold the lining with 1/2 inch seam allowance and sew it to the shell with a blind stitch. If you have extra lining, you can just make a little fold in the center back of the jacket. Don't forget to add your buttonholes and sew on the buttons, and also add a button shank so that your buttons aren't completely flat against the coat, which will make it really hard to button the coat. I also added a backing button to keep this area of the facing from wearing out. And there you have it, your very own custom Quinn coat. If you'd like to check out the pattern, it'll be linked below. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next one.